This is the first video on oligopoly and game theory. And if you're following along in the textbook, the reading for these videos will come from the second part of chapter 15 after monopolistic competition, that portion on oligopoly, but also chapter 9, which is the chapter that deals with game theory. And in this video, we'll be introducing the concept of oligopoly, doing some definition and examples, and talking about why do we use game theory to analyze this market structure instead of a graph. So remember this chart that was going to encapsulate the middle portion of our course? We're now done with perfect competition and monopolistic competition, and we're moving along the spectrum closer to monopoly. We're doing our last market structure, oligopoly. Very few firms. The product type is not very important, and some barriers to entry. I'd say the key feature of oligopoly is that there's few firms. The key feature of monopoly was the incredibly high barriers to entry that led to one firm. The key feature of monopolistic competition was differentiated products, propping up your demand in the short run. And the key feature of perfect competition would be that there are no barriers to entry. If you had to say what was the defining feature. So here we're thinking about a market structure with very few firms, product type doesn't really matter. And the reason why there are few firms is that there are some barriers to entry. So first thing I want you to do is brainstorm. Think of a market that feels like that, where you've been a consumer recently. So just pause and tell me if you can name a firm that competes in oligopoly that you've bought from recently. Here are a few that I thought of. So like I said in class last week, I think streaming is close to oligopoly. There are less than 10 platforms where you can choose to legally stream large quantities of shows. And each of those has high barriers to entry because they have to buy all the rights to the show, and then very low marginal cost after they buy the rights. So they are going to have economies of scale. It's going to be a hard industry to break into unless you are a big enough company to buy up the rights to lots of different shows. Why would anyone want to be on your platform? Walmart, Best Buy, Target, Amazon, around the holiday season, retail in America is getting close to an oligopoly, and you'll watch the prisoner's dilemma play out with pricing if you pay attention this Black Friday season. Pretty much the standard example of oligopoly is always OPEC. So OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, not all the petroleum exporting countries in the world. Saudi Arabia is the biggest member, some Middle East countries, and Venezuela, Angola, Ecuador, Algeria, but they have the bulk, they control the bulk of world, global crude oil production. And we're going to talk a lot about how they operate as a cartel, why you could describe the member countries as being locked in an oligopoly. So just to refresh, an oligopoly is a market structure where there are only a few firms, and that is the key. We're going to talk a lot about duopolies in this class, and a duopoly is where there are two dominant firms. The reason why we talk about duopolies a lot is because humans are best at thinking and drawing in two dimensions, so it's easier to think about only two firms at a time. But most of the insights we get from two firms will apply equally well to a market where there are like around 10 or fewer firms. And remember, the product type is not that important. It could be like OPEC, where they sell identical product, the crude oil is all the same, or it could be like Netflix, Disney Plus, Hulu, streaming, where the product is really differentiated and they're competing based on their original content. The reason why there are only a few firms is that there are some barriers to entry. It's much more difficult to enter than perfect competition, where anybody can make eggs in their backyard, or monopolistic competition, where many different firms can produce t-shirts and brand them differently. So this is why there are only a few firms. Examples of some of those barriers are all the reasons why monopolists got barriers to entry. So it could be something like economies of scale in production. Bigger is cheaper. Boeing and Airbus is a very stereotypical example of an oligopoly. two firms dominate the global airplane manufacturing market. And that is due to extreme economies of scale, where their production facilities are some of the largest buildings in the entire world. Once you've built that, it's relatively cheap for you to produce a plane, and an entrant is going to have big barriers to getting in. Could be economies of scale on the demand side, so something more like a network good. So I would say that phone manufacturers have a mix of economies of scale on the supply side and the demand side, but there are gains to having more people in your family all have an Apple phone. Like for a while, it was like the black sheep of my family because I didn't have an iPhone and I couldn't FaceTime, and my parents couldn't figure out how to install an app. So there are some gains to having everyone in the Apple universe, like texting and stuff like that can work better. You could say that social media is another close to oligopoly network good market. Depends on whether you want to say that Instagram and TikTok and Facebook are competing when Facebook owns two of those platforms, and maybe they don't really compete for your attention. You could make that argument. Could be something not related to economies of scale and supply and demand side, but something more like scarce resources. OPEC has an oligopoly because those countries control the bulk of the crude oil drilling in the world, because they were endowed with the bulk of the crude oil resources. So they control those scarce resources. Or aggressive business tactics, like the retail oligopoly is a combination of aggressive business tactics by Walmart, Amazon, Target, and economies of scale, that bigger is cheaper, more power over suppliers. You can push people who have their products on your site and in your shelves to give them to you for close to cost when you're that big. So there are lots of reasons why oligopolists erect barriers to scale, but they're all related, mostly to the ones we've learned. So I wanted to pause and think for a second. Why do you think we use game theory to analyze oligopoly? Why are we going to not do any graphs this module? Why are we going to use a whole new way of thinking about firm behavior? So just pause and take this quiz before I explain to you why. Why do we use game theory to analyze oligopoly? For some reason, the slide is not advancing. I'm going to try and be patient. This is the week of being patient. Pause for a sec. Sorry, not sure what was going on there. I was having some screen sharing issues, but here's the quiz that I want you to take. So pause and take this quiz. Why do we use game theory to analyze oligopoly? What are your first thoughts? The answer is firms are so interconnected that strategic interaction between firms has a major impact on profit. Because there are so few firms in the market, what your rival does with their Black Friday prices really affects your profit. So you're not just going to ignore that. Here's demand, here's my marginal revenue, here's my marginal cost. Looks like I should just price things here. Because there's a rival who can sneak in and lower prices and steal a lot of your customers, the graph doesn't really help us predict what's your best move. What's your best response to a rival? So we're going to be thinking more about strategic interaction. So the key features of oligopoly are that strategic interaction between a firm and its rivals has a major impact on profit. And I'll define strategic interaction in the next video. Firms care more. They care about more than just imitation and entry. There's been strategic interaction in our model in the past. You entering lowers my price in perfect competition. There's been imitation. You creating a substitute droops my demand curve in monopoly or monopolistic competition. But now it's going to be much more than that. Could be the competitor's price that really affects you. Could be the amount of oil they drill or release, the quantity they produce. It could be their ads. It could be their lobbying power. So firms are going to take their competitors' expected strategy into account when they set their own price, their own output, their own advertising and lobbying budgets. And that means that we can't use the graph. We cannot analyze their optimal individual quantity or price using the standard graph or model, because it really depends on what their rival does. And the branch of theory that integrates what a rival does is called game theory. So that is why we use game theory. So that's the end of that video. And we'll come back next time and talk about what game theory is.